co-founders of iCardiac. Mike Potterman, who couldn't be here today, is my husband, and so I'm replacing him. And Alex Zapesochny, so the three of us co-founded iCardiac over 6 years ago now. Prior to iCardiac, Mike and myself were involved with Virtual Scopics, which is another local company here in Rochester, and iCardiac provides similar services to what Virtual Scopics did, which is all in pharmaceutical research and development. We perform all kinds of testing. Virtual Scopics does image biomarker measurements, image processing from MRI CT images, which are digitally collected in clinical trials, and iCardiac processes electrocardiograms, also collected in clinical trials with the purpose of assessing cardiovascular safety of new drugs.
And my name is Alex Zapesochny. Actually, Sasha was mentioning to me when all of you were doing introductions that this is a very diverse group, and it really is. And my background is actually somewhat unusual for somebody who's now an entrepreneur. I actually started off as an attorney. I was a prosecutor in New York City doing all sorts of criminal trials and things like that. I also was in Washington, D.C. working on presidential campaigns, doing policies and things like that. But oftentimes, no matter what you start off in, somehow the whole entrepreneurial thing oftentimes draws you in. And so about 12 years ago, I ended up moving back to Rochester, my original hometown. And there was a company here called, at that time, Linnell Systems, which had been started in a garage by a couple of engineers who were very frustrated over at Kodak, as oftentimes happens. And they were looking at that point to grow. So that company grew very nicely. I was part of the executive management team there, and over time moved away from the law and more into operational roles. That company got sold about 6 years ago for $440 million. So it's a very nice success story. And what oftentimes happens with nice success stories is there were a lot of happy individuals who had shares in that, and they were willing to provide money for something else. And at that point, Mike and Sasha had also recently been at a point where Virtual Scopics, which at this point is still the only University of Rochester spin-out, which is a public company, it had relatively recently at that point gone public, and people were very happy at that moment. So we luckily had a good amount of money at our disposal at that point to start the next company, iCardiac, and that's doing pretty well at this point as well. Also, Sasha, Mike, myself, and a number of other individuals are also involved in another effort called Innovocracy, which got started, some of you may have heard of it, in the last 6 months, where we work with the University of Rochester. Cornell, hopefully soon will work with RIT as well to help companies get money via crowdfunding, actually, for prototypes and proof of concept activities. So that's
several have been from the U of R, several have been successfully funded.
So we're very happy to have this discussion. Even though this is not a tiny group, please feel free to jump in, because I think the value of something like this is really more about the examples and the discussions that we could have, and so feel free to jump right in. So this is a discussion has sort of morphed over time, because one of the key problems anywhere, but especially in places like Rochester, although that's being somewhat too narrow. In reality, if you're living outside of Boston, San Francisco, New York, Boston, and other places, it's really hard to raise money. And even those places, I'm sure it's harder than it seems. So this is a discussion that we've sort of developed, and they gave actually, Mike and Sasha, a version of this at Dartmouth. I gave a version of this at Simon School a few times. And it's evolved over time. Now, one of the things I will say is that this is a little bit more focused on companies that are a little bit more similar to iCardiac and Virtual Scopics and others, where what you're looking to do is actually raise money from venture capitalists, and you have potentially patentable intellectual property because you're pursuing a medical angle or something like that. Now, just to be clear, and I know that all of you gave introductions, but so for those of you who maybe didn't clarify which kind of company you have, which people in the room think that they want to raise money from venture capitalists versus, in a minute I'll ask people who potentially want to raise money from angels or friends, but who here is actually interested in how to raise money from venture capitalists in particular? Just one person? Two? 1.5? The non-Polish Oscar. That's actually interesting. Okay, and the rest of you think that you're going to raise money probably from angels, or is that Yes? Okay.
Well, a lot of angel funding kind of has a hybrid versions of the venture funding, and some angels are super angels, so they kind of intersect. Some of it will apply as well.
Well, and actually, in many ways, I think it'll largely apply, because once you get outside of the realm of asking your friends and family who aren't necessarily looking at your business plan the same way that somebody else obviously would, but once you get to even angel investors, they typically will be able to ask most of the questions that venture capitalists ask. So this is still, I think, kind of the paradigm or the way you should approach figuring out whether or not what you have is really bulletproof and will be compelling to whoever is going to invest in your business. Now, we did put together some resources. At the end, I'll give my email address, so if anybody wants these, because I'm sure you're not going to want to write these down off the board, but Mike Totterman came up with these, and I'll be happy to share the slide deck with you, including these particular.
You actually just can send that to me. I can put it up, and
I
make
agree
sure
with
people can find it
that as
that way.
well. So we want to break this discussion up into a couple of different pieces. One is the portion of, okay, once you actually are at the point where you want to find a VC or an angel investor, etc., what are the sort of things that once you're in front of them you want to be able to say? Now, some of this information in some ways is kind of basic. I mean, you could have found it in other places, but it is one of these categories where it's basic, but it's actually kind of complex, and you still need to understand the nuances of what it is you say and how you say it. And so we'll focus on that at first. The latter half of the presentation is going to get into a few other things, which are maybe a little bit less intuitive, about how do you actually motivate a investor to give you money, because so many of the things that you think motivates an investor aren't really the things that motivates him. In other words, it's not just a matter of going over and saying, here's my presentation, look, I've hit A, B, C, and D, everything sounds great, give me money. That's not typically the way that process works, whether you're dealing with angels or venture capitalists. So and that part I think will be interesting to all of you as well. And again, feel free to jump in with any questions. So first of all, okay. Anybody here pitched to a VC? All right. So, well, VCs now are an interesting lot. First of all, there's obviously a relatively limited number of them. More and more of them these days, just so you all know and can kind of set your expectations appropriately. Oftentimes, unless their mandate is specifically to look at very early stage technologies, and there are some of those around town. So, for instance, Excel Partners is one group locally that is willing to look at things much earlier on. And there are a couple others kind of in the vicinity, but that's the one that's based in Rochester. But otherwise, most of them are more interested when you get to the stage where you actually have some revenues, where you potentially have a patent. They're kind of looking at a slightly different level of company. But one of the things you should absolutely know in terms of all VCs is they typically do not just respond to people emailing them. Even though it's very easy to find their email addresses and you can send them things, you can call them, they typically do not see people who get to them that way. The volume of things that come to them is just way, way too large. And so you absolutely must find a connection, which sounds difficult, but it's actually not all that difficult. So there's this kind of whole networking concept of the power of weak bonds. There's probably people you know, whether you realize it or not, that have a very clear connection to whatever venture capitalist or angel group you're looking to find. So talk to people in your family who are lawyers, entrepreneurs. If you're part of a university system, undoubtedly, if you go to your center of entrepreneurship or something like that, somebody there is going to have friends within this region or whatever region that is connected to a venture capital firm. So focus on that. Now, the other key thing to remember is that venture capital firms, because they get such a large volume of submissions looking for money, in many ways, think of them as maybe the HR department of Google or Facebook or something like that, where the volume of things that they get is so much, they're basically looking to find a way to get rid of things as quickly as possible so they can filter it down to the things that are actually of interest to them. So when we talk about this, it's very important to note that if you have 5 out of 6 of these elements, but the 6th one is clearly missing, that's not a minor thing. They don't grade on a curve in something like this. You need to find a way to address all the things that they're used to seeing, and it should be compelling in your business plan or in your presentation. Otherwise, you just won't get to the next level with that. The most important thing to anyone, but especially VCs or to organized angels, let's say, which are oftentimes kind of people who are older and with money and want to invest in something that that's connected usually to their community, is who's the founding or management team. And there's some very particular things that they're concerned about. Now, one of the things that they, of course, absolutely want to see in some form or fashion is some sort of track record. And track record doesn't necessarily mean success in the sense of that your company was super successful, but it really, really helps. So, for instance, I definitely cannot take all the credit for Linnell and the $440 million exit. That would be a ridiculous joke. But when I met with people, of course, that creates all sorts of positive things in their minds. And so a lot of it is really more about thinking, okay, how do I position this? Even if you're coming, for instance, from a larger company, even if you were working at some sort of smaller startup, you got to find a way to show that you've actually done something before that's relevant, and then it's succeeded in whatever realm is realistically called a success.
Actually, on that point, it's infinitely easier to do it second, third time, even if your first thing won't. But you still got funding before. When we were raising money for Virtual Scopics, it took us about two and a half years to actually get a VC firm to invest. And with iCardiac, the whole process took 6 months. Because we had a successful exit, and Alex just had a successful exit. And so there was no, and we went basically to the same VCs that we hit prior to, with Virtual Scopics fundraising, and they turned us down before. So now when we came in, and when they turn you down, it's not like, no, go away. I mean, they're very friendly. They want to develop relationships. They want to nurture the teams. So it's easy to build on that experience, go back and say, well, remember 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, and now we have this, and this was a success, and now we have this similar idea with mission. So that was very easy. So some of the VCs that turned us down first time invested the second time.
So one of the things that you'll hear quite often is this term of, are there serial entrepreneurs? And it's actually exactly for the reason that Sasha indicated, because people who are really in this, like venture capitalists, they understand that even from the things that may have not been a great success, but hopefully where the lack of the great success wasn't because of some sort of incompetence that's clearly can be pointed at you. But if you could show that you've done something before that's entrepreneurial, that goes such a long way in many of their minds to believe that you understand what it'll take. Because the startup thing is really, really hard. And that's okay. It's also really, really rewarding in all sorts of ways, largely in personal ways, in terms of being able to have the power and the freedom to live your life the way you want and create the things around you that you want and have people around you only that you want. It's a wonderful thing, but it's really hard, and they understand that unless you've done it before, you may not realize just how hard it is. Actually, that way, it's almost like being a parent. I mean, it's one of those things that people tell you what it's like, but until you're actually in the middle of it, it's really hard to fully grasp. And I know some of the younger people from the university may still not understand what I'm talking about, but someday you will. The other thing to keep in mind is oftentimes when you are talking to them about the members of the team and the background, there's a big difference, especially people in the startup world, between saying I have a business background and I have a startup background. And oftentimes people who have a business background and don't have a startup background don't fully kind of appreciate this difference, but venture capitalists do. So oftentimes what people do to get over potentially the issue of not having a business expert on their team is they'll go to somebody who perhaps was part of a big company or some other form of business. And sometimes we see what I think are horror stories where people say, oh, I have a brother-in-law and he's an insurance agent, and that insurance agency is so great, and there's no doubt that this is the person that should be leading our ophthalmology product company. And, well, by the way, that's a real example. And that did not work out. And venture capitalists see that kind of thing all the time, and it's not going to be particularly compelling. The other thing that's really relevant, and again, this does not have to be you, the individual. Oftentimes what they're really looking at is, in fact, it's generally pretty bad if you're by yourself going into a venture capitalist and trying to raise money. Really what you need is truly a team. And therefore, even if you individually don't have some element of this, maybe you've never been in a startup before, maybe you don't have particular industry expertise, the key really is to come in there with a well-rounded team. At the very least, these individuals should be there in some sort of advisory capacity, and to be able to present yourself as a group having most of the things that a successful team ought to have. One of the things that's also very important, although I would say this is much more relevant for companies like iCardiac or those who are doing something which is based on deep science or something that's patentable. It's also very important to obviously come in there with a team that has deep scientific credibility. So if you are doing something in optics or medicine, etc., you ought to try to associate yourself with individuals who are well-published in peer-reviewed journals, who are well-known in industry circles, and when somebody looks at them, they'll say, okay, this is not just a scientist, but this is a true leader in the field, and that association will help us get our foot in the door into all sorts of commercial situations. And the other part that is very important, I think this may not be, frankly, as obvious, this last part, is are all the individuals kind of credibly committed to this company? This is an issue, for instance, that happens oftentimes with companies that are being spun out of universities. Because when a couple of professors and a couple of students go up to a venture capitalist, for instance, of course the venture capitalists assume that the students are probably really in it. But they know that as much as those scientists are sitting there and are saying that they're going to be behind it, that there's a pretty good chance that a month later they're working on some paper or preparing for a conference and aren't necessarily really going to be there and committed in the way that they want to see it. One of the ways to think about this is if you were to give somebody your money, just even on a personal level, I mean, you'd want to know that no matter what, they're going to do everything possible to make sure that the venture is a success. And oftentimes, with scientists, you need to, or which are involved with your venture, you need to find a way to explain either that they really are committed and why, and if not, why it is that they're only that their part-time commitment is necessary. This is actually something that we've had to navigate a number of times, including in iCardiac, where clearly the chief medical officer and the chief technology officer were not going to step outside of their tenure at University of Rochester positions, but it was okay because the technology was at such a point and we were able to explain it compellingly as such that we only needed them about 1 day a week for maybe a year, and that's something the university was going to give permission to do. And so it didn't matter in our particular case, and you just need to think through how do I convince everybody that the people who need to be committed to it are. Now, the other part, and this obviously is going to be different depending on what type of startup you have, but for those who are not looking into do potentially a technology business, think of maybe take this word and think of it as something else. Like, what is the innovative thing that you're doing? What is it that makes and creates a really competitive advantage for you? For those who are doing technology, obviously the technology oftentimes is the thing. And the key thing to consider and be able to explain is, what is it that we're actually doing that's really, really better? Now, depending on what business you're in, this means different things. So for instance, Mike Totterman, our third co-founder, he was a venture capitalist in San Francisco in the heyday of the late 1990s, and they were investing in startups that were doing networking and things like that. So for them, they would not invest or look at anything that wasn't going to provide a 10x improvement in terms of speed, whatever other things they were looking for. Now, obviously, that's not the way things work in other areas. But you need to have a very significant advantage. A marginal advantage typically does not get anybody excited because they realize that while larger companies may be a little bit slower or have something that's maybe not quite as good or as fast as what you have, because they have all these other things, distribution, scale, the ability to buy other companies that can match your technology, that being a little bit better is not anywhere near good enough. And the other part, and again, this is a little bit more for medical and other type of kind of pure science companies, is do you have a defensible intellectual property position? Now, for those who are in those areas, please consider the fact that even if you have no patents, this is one of those areas where you can still do quite a bit on almost no money to put yourself in a much better position to be able to get a venture capital investor. So even, for instance, in the case of iCardiac, while we were there and they had already applied for one patent, one of the things that we had done right before licensing this technology to the University of Rochester is we went out there and we weren't exactly sure, as oftentimes you're not when you start, which part of the technology was going to be the most useful to us and which part was really going to be kind of a success out in the marketplace. And so we put a number of provisional patents in place and kind of decided to figure it out later. Oftentimes that's good enough, and that's a small investment. It could be anywhere from a few $100s to get one patent, a provisional patent, if you're able to do it yourself, or get somebody in your team that maybe has some experience doing it. It doesn't need to be a patent lawyer oftentimes. But even with a few $1,000s, you can typically put together some decent provisional patents and be able to move forward with a good story to your investors in terms of, okay, if this is good, at least they'll be able to protect it. In other types of situations, let's say you have a web startup or something where patents and things like that are not going to protect you, obviously the story needs to be a little bit different. And there the story is more about barriers to entry, where you can sit there and say, okay, if I do this and I have a first mover advantage or whatever it is that's going to make me special in this particular circumstance, the reason that somebody coming up behind me won't be able to replicate me is something. And you need to have a compelling reason, obviously, as to what that is. So, for instance, I think if there was another search engine better than Google, maybe some people think there is, I don't know. But if there was something that I thought was better than Google, I probably wouldn't have much of an issue switching. I wouldn't think much about it. But if all of a sudden somebody came with a Facebook competitor and none of my friends are there, I mean, that represents a situation where, very credibly, people probably wouldn't switch over for more or less, unless there was some really great reason to do so. And that's the kind of explanation you need to come up with in these situations. The next part that's very key is really understanding the problem that you're solving. This is another one of those things that's especially a problem in universities, quite honestly, because oftentimes there you have scientists that really love whatever they're doing, they think whatever they're doing is great, and it very well may be on some pure science basis, and they're chasing a problem to solve. And sometimes other people, even who are not scientists potentially, just fall in love with the technology solution so much that that becomes the key. When really the technology is really just a means to an end. You need to actually start most times with the problem and not the technology, not the variation, the iteration of a solution in order to have something that ultimately is going to work. Another key thing is to be able to explain, hopefully, that your market is growing. Now, one of the nice things we had, and I'll kind of skip down to one other thing that it's related to, at the time that iCardiac was starting, was that there were two macro events that happened at that time, which may or may not really have been all that relevant, but they seemed very relevant. So one is that we started the company in 2006, but in 2005, there was this guidance that was put out by the FDA. And it was also part of this consortium that was international, so usually when they do it, or actually it came from this international consortium, so the European regulators and Japanese, etc., were thought to be also going to follow the same thing. And so everybody suddenly assumed that just because a year ago this guidance had come out about this very precise, detailed sort of cardiac safety testing, that now this market was all of a sudden created. One thinks that if all of a sudden this market is created, that obviously whatever was there before probably wasn't, the supply of it probably wasn't enough to meet the new demand, and therefore, hey, we're at the beginnings of this amazing market. The second thing that happened was the Vioxx scare. I'm sure people probably remember when this was a very big deal, people were dying, there was a cardiac safety issue that was actually on the front pages of the papers like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Now in reality, the Vioxx scare was a different type of cardiac safety problem. It wasn't electrophysiological, but it really didn't matter because people at that point realized that, okay, the FDA is probably going to take this cardiac safety thing more seriously, it's going to be a CEO level issue, and because of this new guidance, this market will probably grow. It'll probably be $1 billion, $2 billion. There are all sorts of estimates. Now, that didn't really turn out to be true. The guidance went into a slightly different direction, or at least it caused people to move in a different direction than people thought. The Vioxx thing, like most big things in the news, died down after a while. But luckily, these were big things at the time that we happened to be standing in front of venture capitalists. And you need to find whatever momentum, whatever dynamics are driving and fueling the industry that you're trying to break into and solve a problem in, to be able to explain why is it that what you're doing really is relevant. Not only is it relevant, but you happen to be at the right place at the right time. And with most things, you can find that if you really think about it. The other thing that's very important is that, in addition to being able to say it, you want to be able to point your investors or potential investors to individuals, because oftentimes the next question is, this is exciting, this is wonderful, I like your business plan, I like what you're saying, who can I talk to? Well, and even if they don't say it, just know that they're going to go back and talk to people that you may not want them to talk to. And so oftentimes you actually want to be able to offer up legitimate, credible individuals within your industry that will validate two things. That this is really, really a problem, and not just a problem, but one that's costing somebody a lot of money, a problem that they're willing to pay a lot of money to fix, and secondly, that whatever it is that you have the kind of the early beginnings of, or perhaps not the early beginnings of, but the solution for, is the thing that will solve this problem, and they can't find anything else that does it as well. Now, in our case, with iCardiac, one of the nice things that allowed us to raise money was that Mike and Sasha, when they were at Virtual Stopics, developed a really good relationship with Pfizer. And Pfizer at that point was more in a position than today to be doing all sorts of experiments where individual scientists and others had these budgets and they could give you these studies to basically validate things. Now this was ending right around the time that we started the company. Yeah, we were basically their last experiment. But what was very nice is it was still a validation from what was then, I guess still is, right, the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, or are they now number 2? No?
But they're in the top 10.
Yeah. Well, at the time we were raising money, we were able to say that the world's largest pharmaceutical company was interested in what we had to provide. They actually eventually ended up being an equity investor in the company, plus giving us a few $1 million. That was like the last big hurrah for them in terms of paying for somebody else to validate the technology. But it doesn't obviously have to be Pfizer. It just has to be somebody credible. And I remember at one point made a joke that, frankly, even if Pfizer wanted us to, sell them paper clips or whatever was going to create a relationship that we could legitimately talk about, that we could provide the names of these Pfizer individuals, we were going to do. And luckily in this case, it was actually a deal we really
not just Pfizer, we also offered a couple of experts that our scientists had, like maybe friends from NIH and from Veterans Administration, so people who were in that field, who knew about the problem, who were doing their own research, and could verify and say, yeah, these guys know what they're talking about, this is a real problem, and we believe in this type of a solution. So that was a very useful that group of people we could point to disease.
Actually, if I remember correctly, that meeting in Buffalo that they had, that was before we closed the Pfizer deal, right? So the meeting where they flew in Hillary Clinton and the president of Pfizer.
John Lomacki,
Yes.
president of Research and Development.
Yes. So, but actually, that's a good example. So here we are in Western New York. Even though actually New York City is the headquarters of Pfizer, but Connecticut is where a large portion of the individuals we dealt with and where they have large kind of chunks of their personnel. But here in Western New York, as it often does, because we're always trying to improve things through things like NextFlex, they organized an event in Buffalo that was actually very much like this. And somehow they convinced Hillary Clinton it was a good idea, and Hillary Clinton called Pfizer and convinced them that it was a good idea to fly some of their most important key people for the day to go speak in Buffalo at the medical center. So at that point, Mike, Sasha, and I actually drove over there, and we weren't really listening, but we knew that we were going to sit kind of by the door, and when the head of R&D was going to walk by, we were going to do this. And credit to Sasha that she was the one being the salesperson extraordinaire to very quickly and kind of sweetly just walk right up and pretty much bump into this guy. And so we start chatting, and
I do what I have to do.
and all of a sudden he's listening and he hears about the connection to Virtual Stopics, and he says, we think this whole cardiac safety thing is a real problem. In fact, my sense is that we're losing at least $1 billion drug a year because we don't know how to properly test these drugs. We think that it's falling into a gray area. Now, of course, the week after that, Sasha's calling her contacts in Pfizer and saying, you know, you guys apparently have a problem that's costing $1 billion a year. And so you have to be extremely aggressive, frankly, oftentimes to find this validation, and it comes in many different forms and everywhere. But you know, there we were in Buffalo, finding a connection to the head of R&D of Pfizer, and that helped us to close that deal. Now, financial elements. I think that I did not hear too many people say that they were, I mean, I heard a few people say that they were business majors, but you're not a finance major, right? Are there any people here who studied finance? Okay. Any people here who know accounting?
I do on a daily basis, so yeah.
Okay. So even though oftentimes when people are putting together this team that they go to a VC pitch with, nobody's usually on there as an accountant or a finance person. And that's okay in many ways, but you still have to take this part of it quite seriously for various reasons. You have to understand a number of things. One is kind of the macro elements of what it is that you're trying to address. Because ultimately, while people are interested in the team, they're interested in the business, they also really want to understand, okay, how does this make sense financially from both a revenue and a cost perspective? And even though you may not be a finance or accounting major, you're the only one in the room, you're the only one who understands this, and so you have to actually get this, at least to the level where you can answer questions really quite well. One of the key things, obviously, is, all right, what are people paying in whatever form that payment comes to solve whatever problem or whatever the current alternative is to your product or service? This is obviously a key thing. And one of the things you can expect if VCs or whoever is interested is that they will oftentimes start jumping on Google and they'll start trying to figure that out themselves. You don't want them, frankly, to kind of go off without you providing them this information in terms of what's the alternative, how much is it costing people now, how much value does it create, which is, okay, you know, what are people really willing to pay you to solve this issue? Now, the other part is, what is the path to get from wherever you are today with your technology or your service to actually getting those first revenues in? And oftentimes, these are obviously different issues, for instance, in a medical company, where even though, by the way, even with us, one of the reasons that we specifically chose the path that we did with iCardiac, and even what Virtual Scopics did, because there's a number of different ways to go with something like a medical product. But in the case of being able to apply it not for use by doctors, which requires years and tens of millions of dollars of clinical trials and FDA approvals, there's this other path. If you can apply it to clinical trials, the path it's there, but it's not really well defined, and you can actually get revenues more or less right away. I'm making that sound way easier than it really is. But the point is, the revenues come faster. And that was actually a large portion of why we approached it that way. Yeah. We could have approached it actually as a clinical product.
The story behind Virtual Scopics was Mike and I were writing the business plan when we were still in business school at Dartmouth. And you know, I took it as an entrepreneurship project for my second year of business school. And all along, the business plan was around using this image processing technology for diagnostic applications. So basically, if you're doing a hip replacement or knee replacement, the surgeon would be able to customize, or the company that's manufacturing the prosthesis would be able to customize that to you specifically, not just small, medium, large, as they have it right now. And so that was the whole idea behind it. But when we started looking into it more closely, we realized, oh my God, it will take $20 million, $50 million just to get the FDA clearance, and then it's unclear when you're going to get reimbursed for this device. So the reimbursement in medical diagnostic is a whole story which we're not going to touch today. And when we realized that, we said, well, we have to rethink what can we do, and through some serendipity, we actually found this niche. I mean, it's not very obvious to people that there is a niche where all these medical technologies can be applied in pharmaceutical R&D, and lo and behold, there's no requirement for FDA clearance. You need to still validate, but because it's being used in clinical research, you actually don't need to have it cleared as a medical device because you're performing the service. You're not treating, diagnosing, you're just performing measurement service. And so we said, oh, okay, well, we can try that. We tried that, and that worked. And then we did the same thing with iCardiac. We still think about potential future diagnostic applications for iCardiac, but it's very...
Well, we've been thinking for 6
We've
years.
been thinking for 6 years, and it's
We're
very
just close
expensive
now.
and very, very... Now, on the other hand, for virtual scopics, we now have another spin-out, which is called Qmetrics, and we have a partnership with them. The original scientific team that left virtual scopics and started this company. And guess what? They're applying it in diagnostics, in making personalized prosthesis. So with companies such as the Electronic and some other manufacturers of hip and knee prosthesis, so they're actually doing it. So that it's happening now, about 10 years later. So sometimes you have that idea and it eventually can percolate, but it may be too early, and so you have to look for something else. So maybe eventually with iCardiac we'll have something to
Well, but even in the case of Qmetrics, by the way, I mean, the reason they had the time to let it percolate all this time is because they also went into the clinical trials business, and they got a 7-figure study, which now gives them enough time to build out everything else they want to build out. So this is a very key issue. Now, if you don't have a medical company or something similar to that, and instead you're talking about a website and how many visitors we have, etc., obviously that question's a little bit different. But even there, despite what people may hear, that VCs don't care about how do you make money, that as long as you have millions of users, it's okay. There's a few companies that have no doubt taken that and done very well with it, but don't assume that your company will be one of them. Those are kind of strange outliers. You still need to have a very clear story that, okay, how is it that I convert all these 100,000 visitors or whatever it is that I'm getting every month on my website to a real business? I mean, what's going to do that for me? It's a big question. And beyond the first revenues, what is it or how long will it be before, first of all, you're generating enough cash to be break even, but then obviously beyond that as well. You do need to understand very clearly what's the competition. Now, sometimes people will say, no, this idea is so unique, there's no competition. Maybe. I think I have those ideas sometimes, but it's not really true. I mean, there's always something else. There's always some competition. You just need to unearth it. And so every business person or startup person, I think, should spend at least a day or two at some point going on Google or whatever and finding every single competitive thing out there. There's probably stuff out there. Usually, maybe it's not obvious, maybe it's not in the trade papers, but out there is competition, or at least there's that alternative. I need to understand what it is because VCs will find it. You need to understand what are the barriers to entry for people following you. We talked about that a few minutes ago. And obviously the key is, why are you better positioned than anyone else, given the fact that oftentimes people can copy ideas, they can be a fast follower, etc. But what is it that's going to actually allow you to succeed, but not the person coming in behind you? I talked a few minutes ago about the importance of understanding your business from a financial and accounting standpoint. So typically when you present or send out a business plan, it's very, very important that you send out financial projections. Now, you will hear people say, and it's absolutely true, that these financial projections are in many ways a real joke if you're using them to gauge what will actually happen. In fact, the one thing you can be certain of is that whatever your financial projection is, that will definitely not be what happens over that 5-year period. It just can't happen. It's never happened. But the reason it's important is because this is where people gauge whether or not you've really thought this through on a serious level or not. If you need to, just like with the accounting and finance discussion a minute ago, you need to actually understand what these numbers are about. And the numbers are in two directions. It's not just about, oh, we're going to get to 100 million because year 1 it's $1 million and 4 and 8. I mean, it's not just that side. You also need to understand the cost side. You need to understand what are the likely margins of whatever it is you're selling. What are all the other things that you're going to need to pay for, the insurances and all those things? Not, again, because they're going to be the truth of what happens, but because if you don't know those things, you're going to look kind of silly that you've left them out. And people who are sitting there with 100 other businesses to invest in, many of which seem very compelling, they're going to use your seeming lack of preparation or knowledge as kind of this thing in their guts that it's probably not this one.
Another point there is, once you do get the funding and you start the company, don't use your financial model on the cost side, and spend the money like your financial model tells you. That's the wrong thing to do. Because your revenues are definitely not going to be what you projected. So you have to kind of then, once you get the money, you have to then figure out, okay, what do we do from day one? And it's always, in the case of iCardiac, we were extremely scrappy. Even though we got a big chunk of money, we got $6 million right out of the gate. Most companies go on spending spree at this point. We were extremely frugal, thanks to Alex, and we got our furniture for free. We got.
And I dragged it up.
He dragged it. He stored it in his garage. He dragged it up.
Set the screwdriver.
Every first employee had to put together their own chairs and tables. We basically used friends of friends to get really cut-rate cleaning service. Alex still does a lot of legal work himself. So basically, you cut every penny you can imagine, even if you have money in bank, because you just don't know how long you need it to last. And that mentality, by the way, even though now we're doing well, we're profitable, we have revenues growing and a lot of employees, that culture percolates throughout your history, because then everybody behaves that way. And we're still very frugal, and our investors enjoy the benefits of it. So that's basically the mentality of the proposal. And the financial projections are good. It's more of an exercise in thinking of all the cost items that you are going to have and how you're going to grab the revenues. But please don't use that model to manage your business.
Have people here either read or heard of this book called The Lean Startup? I mean, in many ways, many of us kind of knew that's what we were doing on some gut level before, but this book that came out, I think, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, actually explains what this whole thing is about. And it's not just about being cost-effective, although that's a key portion of it. It's about this whole idea that the startup is really an experiment. That's how it's different than a business. Like a big established business is an experiment. And typically, they buy others who've experimented and gotten something right. The startup is an experiment, and in fact, you need to think of each one as an experiment. Some will fail, some hopefully over time won't. They'll learn lessons, etc. But you want to experiment as cheaply as humanly possible. You want to test it as fast as possible. Not always very easy to do in a medical technology company like iCardiac, but many of the things that you're all interested in doing, you can very quickly and cheaply test it out. Usually the first try won't work. There's actually another good book that I would recommend by Randy Komisar, which is kind of this well-known West Coast venture capitalist, called Getting to Plan B. Again, many people kind of knew that that's what instinctively was happening, that almost no company you could ever imagine got there through their initial plan. That's why these financial projections actually don't make sense. But it's not just the financial projections, it's the entire business plan. Whatever you think is going to happen almost never ends up happening the way you think. In the case of Linnell, that $440 million, actually, quotes, it really was a $440 million success story. But the $440 million success story started off in a totally different business. Because the two founders, when they left Kodak and they had had a similar idea there, they had a non-compete, and so they thought, that we're going to create this thing for the internet. The internet was very big in the early 90s, or at least people thought, this will be huge. Can't miss opportunity, and they were able to raise money for it. After about 3 years, literally nothing was happening. And they were about to kind of go, do we try to give some of the money back? Do we go bankrupt? What do we do? Completely pivoted to the stuff that they'd been doing and had tried to invent over at Kodak, and the company went through the roof within a couple of years. iCardiac actually was definitely a Plan B success story, because we thought that the stuff that the University of Rochester had was amazing. It was so far out there, so much more precise and amazing, and the FDA already liked it. So it felt like a can't lose type of winner. And then, of course, what happened was that when Sasha and the rest of us, but mainly Sasha, went out there and actually tried to sell it, it was so far ahead that people in big companies were really, really scared. Because who in the world in a big company wants to be the first one to try this thing that doesn't even sound or look like anything that's ever been used before for cardiac safety? And so this thing that we actually thought was kind of a joke, that we said, the reason we're going to license this part of it is just to be able to show how much better this other part is. It's just the comparator. The comparator was actually, the comparator became the basis of our business. Obviously, we improved it over time, but that's the Plan B. And that's another reason why oftentimes getting scientists or people who are really in love with the technology is such a problem with startups, because you can't ever believe it's the technology. Startup people aren't about the technology, they're about solving the problem, they're about moving forward. Read both of those books, honestly, if you want to if you want to learn more. They're both amazing books. Exit strategy. Now, exit strategy, usually what people assume this means when you're standing in front of a VC is that they say, well, what's your exit strategy? And the answer is, we'll go public, although people say that less and less because it's a much less attractive option over the last 5 or 6 years, or we'll be bought. But that's actually not what that's not a good answer to that question. What this question is really about is an invitation to explain how well you understand that this is a business, that the people who are putting money into you want their money back. Even in today's day and age where people are a lot more patient than they used to be a few years ago, and in fact, a lot of the VC funds that used to be 10 years now, oftentimes they are willing to have these 2 or 4 years on top of that. But they still need to understand that you understand that that has to be part of the plan. And so your answer has to be much more specific. It has to be more along the lines of, okay, here's my industry. Here are the 8 companies that are looking for companies like mine. They bought 3 companies just like or similar to mine, which were obviously not as good in some way in the last 2 years. Here was the multiple of revenue. Here was the multiple price-earnings ratio, whatever you want to come up with. And here's why when I sell my company in 6.5 years, this is what we're likely to get. That's the kind of level of detail you need to get to with that answer. Now, it also, like many things, probably won't come true, but it shows that you know what you're doing and understand this is a business and not as something else. Now, I'm actually going to skip this for now and go to the second part of what I talked about before, which is, okay, some of those things, at least the words on the paper, may seem intuitive, although, again, I say that they may seem intuitive, but it's important to really understand them and do all of them right. This part may be not so intuitive. Pitching your startup similar to dating. What do we mean by that? So these VCs, these investors of all sorts, they're ultimately still human beings, and they react to things like human beings. So many of the motivations that you would think perhaps are not inside of them, perhaps they're just cold, hard business people that are making decisions on flow charts or whatever. They're not. They're still human beings. And so they're susceptible to a number of different things. One of the worst things you could do trying to pitch your business is to seem eager or available. And I mean, this is what gets actually a lot of people in trouble when they're actually trying to pitch their companies. In fact, what you need to be able to show when you're in these meetings is that, hey, we're going to get to success either way. And so our current path, in fact, that's how oftentimes you can even show it. So our current path to success, with having exactly the amount of money we have now, even if it's 0, is this. We're going to do A, then B, then C, then D, and now we're breaking even after D. Great. But the reason we're here today before you, the venture capitalist, is because while we don't need your money, we think it might be better if we can find the right kind of partner who will invest at the right level. We think we can grow a little bit faster. Maybe there's an advantage to it because we'll be ahead of that person or that person. That they understand. And you know, preferably you can actually find this. I mean, that goes back to what Sasha talked about. Be as cheap as possible. Never be in a position where you're going to run out of money. Quite honestly, whatever that takes.
Even after you got the first round of funding, make sure not to run out of money, because you may need 2 or 3 rounds of funding, and a lot of technology companies need that. But a lot of, especially first-time entrepreneurs, make the mistake to run down the first tranche of funding before going looking for the second one, and that's the worst situation you can be in, because you're gonna get the terms are gonna be atrocious. So never run out of money. That's the lesson. We always have
and never go there with a trajectory that, hey, you know, we're here because in 6 months, you know, we're not going to have payroll money. That's the worst imaginable position. It really is in that sense like dating. You want to see that you're self-sufficient and perfectly happy with anybody, but hey, if you're a good match, okay, then I'll give you a shot. And they react to that. They really do. And it's not a trick or whatever. It's just human nature for people to be slightly repulsed by people to needy. And it definitely applies here. The other thing to keep in mind, and again, this kind of goes into to some degree the human category, is you never want to be single-threaded when you're with your approach toward fundraising. Oftentimes people say, okay, this is the stage of the company where I'm raising money, and I've identified these 3 venture capitalists, and here are their addresses, and I found a lawyer friend who's set up a meeting, and now I'm going one to the other to the other. Now, one of the problems, by the way, which is a little bit unique to Rochester, but not only to Rochester, is oftentimes VCs, they do talk to each other. So when you're doing that, they're in a very much better position than you are. What's really good, if you could possibly find a way to do it, is to be parallel tracking this and to find uncorrelated investor groups. Now, in our case, and this actually also went to this part of it, is that we had individuals from our past lives who had invested money in Virtual Scopics or Linnell that we found that had nothing to do with these VCs. And every time we went to visit these VCs, because by the way, VCs meetings aren't like a one-time thing. I mean, they invite me back and back and back, so typically trying to drag this whole process out, again, because it's in their best interest to do that. Every time we went there, we were able to provide a new piece of information, which is, hey, good news, we've now soft circled X amount of money. And as the number kept growing bigger and bigger, they realized that if they did not move relatively quickly, that some of them would actually not fit into this funding round. And in fact, that's what happened, because we ended up having 3 venture capital firms actually in the deal, but there were 5 who wanted to be in the deal. And because the individuals, our friends, family, etc., and past business colleagues basically squeezed out 2 of them. That's what actually allowed them to know that we didn't really possibly need them, and also that we had to move quick, which is really the next lesson. So the VC model, but it's not just the VC model. People here probably have heard of this concept of option value, right? You want to wait till the last possible second to make any sort of decision with finality in all forms of life. It's a natural thing to want to do, and that's what VCs do also. So oftentimes what happens is when you show up to their office, if they're interested, they generally, well, if they're not interested, they'll find a way to say no, or just they'll smile, and that'll be the end of it. They won't return your calls. But if they're interested, they don't get their checkbooks out or start getting out term sheets. They set up follow-up discussions, and then you go to the follow-up discussion. Oftentimes, what those follow-up discussions are supposedly about is that at some point, because we all get excited about our businesses, and we sit there and say silly things like, next month so-and-so's coming to visit us, or 2 months from now there's this great experiment, and it's looking really good. Oh boy, it's going to be exciting. And so their response is, that's wonderful. Let's see you in 5 weeks. Let's see you in 9 weeks. They tell me all about that experiment. And the process goes on and on and on. Because one of those things may not work out, and then they don't have to invest. I mean, actually, poker is a pretty good example of this as well. You want to see as many hands as possible with as few dollars in the round. That's exactly what they do. And so there needs to be a forcing function. You want to create a justified sense of urgency for them to actually say, wow, now it's a little bit different. If I don't put my money in, I won't see the next hand. I won't be in the round. And that's luckily what we were able to do. But you can oftentimes do it also, because many of you do have, everybody probably knows, right, like the friends and family, oftentimes it's referred to as the 3 F's, friends, family, and fools, right? Everyone's heard that statement. But usually people do have somebody in their lives, and that'll probably invest money in you, sometimes parents or whatever. And if you could find a way to be extremely lean, oftentimes even that can be a forcing function to cause somebody else to give you money before you theoretically don't need their money anymore. The other part that's very important is that people need to be realistic about what the venture capital process is about in terms of what it will take out of you. But this more or less applies to many of the angel funds as well. Because the angel funds, who are kind of the organized angel funds, which have oftentimes their own managers or at least experienced people running it, they basically go on these principles too. First of all, it takes quite a while. It takes 5 to 9 months of pretty consistent work. And as I said, it's not put in an application and wait, 8 months later. You're seeing them every week or 2 or 3, and oftentimes, at least in phone calls, something to keep that process going. The other part of it is, and this is one of those things that gets a lot of people very upset when they realize, because what they typically expect in order for a VC or an organized angel to be able to make their money back and make a profit on your company, is that they expect that whatever round you're at to be able to get about 25 to 40% of your company. And that's pretty much true no matter where your company is in the stage. And it's not even really a matter of greed. The truth is that the venture capital industry, as some of you probably know, and angels are not in a better position, is not this amazingly successful industry. And even for them to get to where they are, which is that many of them don't even meet the benchmarks of if you simply put money into the stock market, they need to be able to really strike well and have a huge multiple on their 1 to 3 companies out of every 10 that's going to do well enough. And that's why they take these very large percentages. One of the things, and Sasha alluded to this, and this is really, really key, and you will have this probably more for individuals who are not looking for money from VCs, but instead are looking for money from organized angels or from smaller investors, is this is sort of, in their minds, a version of the optionality play, where they don't want to give you too much money, because why do they give you, because if you tell them, oh, all I need is $100,000 for this, they're not going to want to give you $1 million for something else. And so what typically happens is they will truly drip feed your business. And so it becomes milestone based. Oh, you're saying that all you need is this to build a prototype, and this is all we'll give you. And then oftentimes they'll actually put in other things saying, and once you get it and you meet the milestone, then we'll lock it in and you'll get our money. But this is a very, very dangerous thing to do to one's business, especially those businesses where you can't run it that way. You did a pretty good job with iCardiac, but it's really hard with certain kinds of businesses to run them legally.
Yeah.
So one of the things you actually should do, and you need a very compelling story to be able to do it, because these people are smart folks, is you need to raise enough money plus a big, big safety cushion. And even then, as Sasha said, try not to spend any of it. But you need to raise money with a big safety cushion to achieve, hopefully, several value-creating milestones. So the next round is at a much higher valuation than your current round.
And actually, at that point, we did have an oops, even though we were experienced in the same industry and started a company in the same kind of space, just a different technology and application. In our business model and financial projections and the costs, we did not project any equipment purchases. And realized about 2 years into it that, oops, we need about...
That wasn't in plan A.
Yeah, it wasn't in plan A. We need about $1 million plus in equipment that we sent to clinical trial sites. And we were able to totally do it without any red flags coming up, like it was always there. So that's the point. And we still didn't run out of money. So you need that safety cushion, because something is going to come up where you say, well, I need to pivot into this kind of business model, but this kind of business model requires me to provide X to my customers up front before I get the revenues or not. So that's what it is. So you basically need to have that safety cushion.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind, obviously, is that, time is your enemy with all of this, especially if you do have a business which requires a good amount of money, meaning employees, a place for them, etc. And so that's another reason, because every month, no matter what, your revenues may not be where they need to be, but every month your costs will be there, and usually there's always something else. And it presents itself in all sorts of ways, but oftentimes there's always something else you can see. If I just had this, let me see if I need it or not. And so the costs oftentimes are kind of empty as this time. The other part, and this is definitely not intuitive until you've actually done this for a while, but strangely enough, you would think that, if you were to go in a store, things cost what somebody says, okay, this makes sense for this to cost X amount of money, right? So I'm buying a phone, and it's $20, it should always be $20. But valuations are very, very different. In other words, things aren't what they oftentimes can be described as being valuable as. Rather, because the VCs have this model that whatever it is that you need, they need 25 to 40% of your business. Oftentimes, your value actually goes in the other direction. In other words, they assume that you come to them and say, "I need $500,000," and they said, well, hopefully you also give a valuation. But normally they would think, without necessarily understanding maybe why, that your valuation probably is something where if you take the valuation, multiply it between 25 and 40%, and that's how much you're raising. I know it seems really strange that how much you ask for actually makes your company worth more, but that is the way things work. And oftentimes it's also about how you present the company. If you come in saying, look, we have a $3 million idea, here's all these reasons why we're looking for $1 million, those numbers will actually make sense to them. And if they like the business, they'll like the percentage, they'll take your valuation. So was that clear to everyone? There are some special issues with university spin-outs, and since we are in the university, and I recognize not everyone is part of university here, it is important to kind of touch upon them, and some of them we already have. Oftentimes when you're trying to create a company, the science is too theoretical. This is one of those things that's actually become even a bigger issue over the last 4 or 5 years. Obviously the economy has changed many different things, but it has absolutely changed the way VCs tend to look at what they want to put money in. So unless they have a special mandate, and usually that special mandate comes with some sort of government subsidy. So in New York State, there are at least 3 companies that are subsidized to give venture capital money, all of it is venture capital money, to Western New York companies. So unless they have some sort of incentive like that, where they're willing to maybe sometimes look at things that are a little bit more theoretical, where their investors aren't going to necessarily expect, because it's government subsidized money, their money back, most of the time, being too theoretical is a huge problem. And I mentioned already the commitment part of it, the IP rights. This is actually even harder than it seems. Now, both U of R and RIT have become very good at this over the last decade, but not all universities are. So this, I think in the case of virtual stopics, because when you guys did it, it was still kind of a new thing to spin out companies. How long did it take?
No, it was, it took a long time, but partially because what happened at the same time as we were raising money and spinning out the company, and having Pfizer as one of the first investors, at the same time U of R was engaged in a humongous lawsuit with Pfizer over COX-2 inhibitor patent. So when we came to U of R and said, we are spinning out a company where Pfizer is going to be investor, it was like, go away. So their lawyers were very much against it, and it took a lot of perseverance and negotiations, and we actually ended up buying the IP, which university never ever does because it's against their charter or whatever and requires act of Congress. But in any case, we were able to buy out the IP because they would not have anything to do with this kind of licensing, where since we're going to Pfizer because of the lawsuit. And so that's why it took such a long time. But with iCardiac, it was basically we went in, we said there's a business plan for that we want. The framework that they have right now is very reasonable as far as the fees that we pay for the licenses and what they allow the researchers to do. So they allow them to consult with us one day a week. And there are a lot of, the relationship with UMR is very cordial and very productive. So as far as their technology transfer office, they know what they're doing.
They do, and RIT does as well. And the other time where this could be a real issue is if what you're doing requires some sort of follow-on research by the university, or where the university has, when they've given you a license, has only given you a relatively limited one in terms of the use or the industry for which it's applicable. So there are certain issues like that you just need to be very careful of, because people pivot, and because if there is really relevant research at the university that you might need down the road, you want to find a way to make sure you have some sort of rights or access to it. Top 4 lessons. Now this is obviously beyond just raising money, but I think they're worth talking about. Maybe this will also kind of kick us into a Q&A session, or anybody who wants to stay after and chat a while. Do you want to actually talk about these?
Okay, I can talk about it. So one of the things is linear strategy. What we mean by linear strategy is basically what they teach you in the MBA business strategy courses or places like that. It says, we have this product, this market, the value proposition, the customers, and so forth, and it progresses from prototype to first test and to some first rollout and then next rollout and then how we go. And this is all linear and it looks very nice and it progresses from A to B. In reality, reality doesn't work that way. But linear strategies are helpful, so as long as you can tell a coherent story, because they help you with storytelling. So you can tell a coherent story and use this in VC presentation. They don't know any better because most of them are used to these types of presentations, and so that makes them feel comfortable. So do that in a VC presentation. But don't think that that's how you're going to run your business. Just don't assume that, because the life is going to be very different. You're going to iterate a lot.
And one thing to add to that is tying it back to this discussion here about pitching and getting investment. one of the things that everyone really should think about, especially if they're taking some portion of their investment money from people they care about, their people that are your colleagues and friends, etc., is that people need to understand that while you're giving them a linear story, in other words, the investors, that odds are it won't work out that way, partially because when things don't work out the way you originally hoped in your business plan, now typically what happens, or typically what used to happen with VCs, is they would say, oh, well, this strategy that we, the VCs who sit on the board, all approve, that can't be the problem. It must be this management team. And so oftentimes because oftentimes VCs take the power to basically pick out the founders, a very, very large proportion of the time they pick out the founders. But there are much more intelligent investors in the VC community, etc. But whoever your investors are, you really do want them to understand what it is you're doing. You want them to understand that odds are whatever it is you put on paper isn't exactly going to happen. And especially if they're your friends and family, the entrepreneurial thing is more relationships than pretty much anything. And so this is not like a minor point to people. I mean, people need to have very realistic expectations that when you're shifting from A to B, it's not because you just were intellectually deficient in coming up with Plan A. It's because that's the way experimentation works. And it's a very, very key point before you take money that the people that are, in fact, that's why the two VCs that weren't in the deal, because we could tell just from the interaction, and it goes to our benefit too to have met with them over and over and over, because we could tell just from those early interactions that they weren't going to get it, that they saw this business as something different, and you never want to take money under those auspices where they think that you're going in a particular direction, because if you don't, there could be huge issues, and startups typically don't work out that way. I mentioned that portion of it before.
Yeah, we already touched on that. You need to build, the most conservative financial model, and you need to add 3 to 5 years to every revenue assumption you're making, because you think that you're going to sell whatever you're going to sell in the first year, you might not, and your strategies may not work out, and you need cash to find alternative solutions and live another money. And so that's the iteration requires some ability to sustain yourself. So have that in mind.
And one of the things about that particular point is some people think that maybe this is more applicable to medical devices or optics or whatever, where obviously it just takes a long time to develop something. But in reality, even when you hear about a lot of the companies that are doing web-based things or software that seemingly was an overnight success story. Now, there are some overnight success stories, but there are people who are struck by lightning. There are all sorts of things that happen, and they're just not the case you should expect. In fact, most of these overnight success stories actually took quite a while of development, and oftentimes under some other different name, under a piece of software that was doing something a little bit different, but where they learned something from that experience. That's where success strikes, and it only seems like it just happened.
Yeah, negotiate on costs, even the ones that are non-negotiable. For example, we do have a patent attorney's office that we work in, because Alex is a lawyer and knows how long things take. We negotiate every deal. Even though you think it's the service fees, what they are, no, we can negotiate every deal. You can negotiate a lot of things. You can find a lot of things for free. So basically, anything you're going to buy for your company, whether it's your infrastructure or furniture or consumables or whatever, we always try to squeeze out every penny of the deal that we do, again, because we're scrapping, we're building a company from scratch, and we need room to grow and innovate.
And actually, a particular note, especially for people within the university setting, where perhaps a lot of the other people you're working with are university students, they don't have bills to pay, etc. Oftentimes, that's obviously there's a whole other element or level that you could get there in terms of free services, and they're not even necessarily free. I mean, one of the things you always have, if you really believe and you have a good story and you have a good plan, is you do have your stock. And so, oftentimes, letting other people or paying them with equity is a pretty good way to get a lot of people excited and looking for it.
When you're starting with the business and you're explaining to venture capitalists, at what point you're explaining you have to pay your employees, how do you pay yourselves if you do? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yes. That's actually, that's kind of an interesting complex question, because with VCs, as we talked before about the kind of all these human dimensions to it, and if you come to them, again, ironically, with this idea of, well, I really believe in this, and therefore I won't even take any money for it, they kind of frankly lose a little bit of self-respect for you. And so if you're dealing with kind of real VCs with big amounts of money, you actually want to come to them. Now, you should be willing to say, look, because I believe in this so much, I'll take this salary, and I'll take less than the average president of a company or whatever at this stage, and you can pay me more with stock options or whatever. There's all sorts of ways that you can show your commitment that you're making less than you could somewhere else. But it's almost kind of a bad thing to show up and say, I'm willing to take no salary. Part of the reason is because things do also take much longer. I mean, not very many people can live 3 to 5 years. Now, if you're a student, maybe you can actually provide that story, and people would understand why you're doing it.
For venture-funded business, typically it's going to be a corporation, so you're going to be employee. Even though you're founder, you're going to be employee of a corporation, and you're going to get paycheck just like everybody gets paycheck. So that's the payment model. Now, how much you're going to pay yourself, that's what Alex was telling. Originally when we started the company, we took about 50% salary cut. Yeah, we did get stock, and that was part of the negotiation. But that's how we thought about it originally. Over time, we brought it up a little bit, but still we're not paying ourselves executives in our industry again in the same size companies. Like hiring executives, not founders. And for hiring employees, that's also a good lesson, because we asked pretty much everybody who joined us to do approximately the same thing, not 50% salary cut, but some cut. People that came from product, they have very cushy jobs and big salaries. So there is expectation you're joining a growing thing. There's a big upside potential. We are compensating everybody with stock options as well as salaries. So that was always a negotiation between the two. There's salary component and stock option component.
I mean, I think if I were taking money purely from maybe angels and other people I knew, and if I were younger without kids, etc., I think, frankly, I would probably definitely still work in some sort of minimal salary when we're eating ramen noodles and have a small apartment and all that. So you're certainly clearly kind of committed, but again, things take a while, and you don't want to be in a position where you basically tell a lot of people, including friends and family who are putting money in, that you're going to stick with this thing without a salary as long as it takes. That may be just not a very practical way to move the company forward. Yeah, that's important.
Oh yes, that is so true. It's one of the key things in growing a company, starting from scratch. It's hiring, especially the first few employees that you're going to hire. Those are very critical hires, and hiring mistakes can really hurt you. Sometimes can be fatal. In our case, we did make some mistakes and we corrected them. So not only you should be very careful as to who you're going to hire, you're also going to be prepared to let them go when they don't work out. And so as far as hiring, and it's probably obvious, but we never ever use recruiters. As a startup, it's your founder, it's your job to know every employee, to vet every employee, to hire exactly who you want to hire. And we mostly hire for attitude. Of course we look for certain skills, but we hire for attitude more than we hire for skills or experience. Because that's a critical component in the startup culture. People need to be self-starters, self-motivated. They need to be much more kind of self-driven versus, I'm just going to show up to a place from 9 to 5 and get my paycheck and go away and worry about it. So people need to be kind of, one of our performance review criteria is, are you thinking as a business founder? Are you thinking as a business owner? Because everybody's co-owner, they all have a lot of stock options. So, so that's a big part of how we hire and how we review the performance and reward at the end of the year. So that's very important. And now, as far as hiring mistakes, they will happen. You have to be very, very careful and be able to get rid of those people. Sometimes the temptation is, I don't want to be the nasty guy or gal who fires, and then they don't like me, and they're going to hate me, and everybody's going to hate me. But what happens is, if you don't do that, and we've seen some examples of that in small companies, especially in small companies, then you demotivate the entire group because this guy is not pulling his weight, and we are, and what's going on is plain and obvious because it's very difficult to hide in a 20-people group versus 20,000 people. So that's a very important point, and we did let go some people and hire new ones, and this keeps everybody very motivated because they know, okay, the company cares. It cares about good performance, and we reward them, and if somebody's not pulling their weight, we replace them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I switched over from the previous stuff I was doing to being in the business world, actually that's one of the things I think that was kind of the biggest surprise to me, because most of us who work in some capacity think of, okay, there's this human resources group, and their job is to find people. And oftentimes what they do is they go and they say, okay, the engineering group needs somebody. What do you need? Oh, I need somebody with Python, I need somebody with 4 years of this, and 8 years of this, and I need grades that are exactly this. And then they, like recruiters, because HR departments are kind of in that way, like internal recruiters, they go off and say, okay, I found you someone with this number of years, and that unfortunately turns out to be the wrong thing. In fact, the other thing that I think that we did quite differently is almost none of the people that we hired for our first, we now have 60 people, at least for the first 20 or so hires, none of them were in a lateral position. In other words, for every single one of those human beings that showed up, they were in some sort of other position thinking, I'm a controller, but I can be a CFO. I'm a software developer, but I think I could be a director of software development. All of them were hoping, thinking they had the skills, and we gave them that opportunity to say, great, here you go. Come in, start from scratch, let's see what you have to do. And this, I think, changed and affected the culture like almost nothing else. And for most jobs, when you really boil down to it, minus a few that I can think of, like biostatistician, although he came right out of a PhD program too, for that matter, he just looked older. And a few other things where you need some hard skills. Almost no jobs that you think need hard skills are as much about the hard skills as they are about the people who are willing to sit down and, very, very importantly in a startup, work in an environment which is completely undefined, where people look at you and there's nowhere to hide. The other thing for us, which is a little bit of a challenge, is there aren't a ton of, or at least certainly weren't as many 6-7 years ago, startups 6 years ago as there are today. And there are, unfortunately for us, not as many success stories here. And so people don't, unlike in places like San Francisco and Boston, have these stories from their friends where, I started a startup and 3 years later my stock option's worth something. They don't have this kind of understanding. And so they come in and oftentimes they're asking, what about that? I had 8 vacation days and now I have 6. And they're focused on all the wrong things because they're not believers in the dream. And you meet people who believe in themselves, believe in the dream, and typically are doing something they've never done before in their lives and love and thrive in that sort of culture. I mean, there's nothing more important than that, than finding the right people. This is your point.
This is the philosophical, the point of reflection on our experience in these kind of startup adventures so far. Success is largely random. That is true about any type of success, whether it's fundraising success or business success or whatever other success. And if you've had success in your life, you will probably agree with this statement. It's basically you can get to a certain point because you're good and you're hardworking, but at the end of the day, it requires some sort of serendipity and some, good karma and other things coming together, where you all of a sudden it becomes a success. And so if you have been on the fundraising circuit for several years and you haven't gotten anywhere, oftentimes it's not because you didn't try hard enough or you're not smart enough or you're doing something wrong. It's probably because that serendipity just wasn't there, and it may be coming up fairly soon. So the point is to persevere, and the point is to not beat yourself up because I've checked all the boxes and the money didn't show up. The VC funding didn't show up.
Well, and there's a particularly timely aspect to that point. Because earlier in the week, there was a Wall Street Journal article that some of you may have read that basically said that 3 out of 4 startups, now not startups that people do in their backyards or dorm rooms, 3 or 4 startups that successfully received venture capital funding failed. Now the reason this wasn't obvious to people before is that just like on Kickstarter, where the failed projects mysteriously kind of disappear off the site, and so things look a little bit more successful than they are. It's kind of the same thing with VCs and with the things that they fund. Oftentimes things don't kind of die officially, they sort of percolate, they're still talked about, and we're in discussions, and somebody's still running it somewhere, and so they're just always around in some sort of ghost form. But there was this well-known researcher at Harvard Business School that actually tracked them down and went into the Wayback Machine and saw what happened to all these websites, and 3 out of 4 startups don't work. And in my opinion, not anything to do with me, but some of the smartest people in the world want to do and actually get into doing startups. And so the fact that 3 out of 4 of them don't succeed isn't a function of the fact that it's not the most intelligent, most driven people that are going to do it. It's just the nature of what we talked about before, which is the startup itself is the experiment. And you actually should think of it that way. And if one doesn't work out, because I think we probably all met people who did like one startup and then they kind of went back into some sort of Kodak or whatever other kind of job and never tried it again, that is the wrong way to think about it. In fact, we talked before about serial entrepreneurs, but there's this whole other idea kind of percolating now, this portfolio lifestyle or being a parallel entrepreneur. Try a lot of these things, just like if you were a scientist, try a lot of experiments. Do them as cheaply as possible, preferably not taking money from your parents and friends and whatever, unless they're very forgiving. And then one of them, over time, will work out. Just don't expect any one in particular to work out. And when you're pitching, good luck, but remember this lesson as well. It's not about you, just keep on going. I think
Just make a comment about any personal investment required for venture funding.
that is a great question. So in the case of iCardiac, that was the expectation, but I would say that was really more the expectation of the individual investor, so the friends and family, because these people are like, oh great, how much are you putting in? And it's a very natural question. And even though you're willing to take half your salary and be whatever, put yourself on the line and skip your children's birthdays, yeah, typically they want to see that you actually put in the money too. VCs, I've never really seen that question. I asked by a VC one.
Another thing, VC invest on paying for the filing patent.
Sorry?
Filing patent.
Will they invest in it? Sure. I mean, it would have to be part of your overall plan. In fact, usually that it should be something you set aside.
Sasha, excellent job. Listen, I have a theory, and I kind of want your opinion on it. And this is maybe because, I'm Polish and I think a little differently, but, I find that Rochester is one of those places where, people often tell you that, well, it's a lot of old money, they're not going to invest in like a lot of new technology. And the funny thing is, I own a window clean company, guys, okay? And in my 7.5 years in the business, I've met some, amazingly successful people. I've built relationships with them, and over the years, there's a handful of them that we keep talking about just the ability of just, invest. And, I hear old money, blah, blah, blah. But I find that there's people, as long as you can get someone who can kind of communicate, hey, this is how you can do this, there's people here in Rochester that are willing to invest major money, okay? Obviously, you guys went out to a lot of venture capitalists, I'm assuming all over the country, maybe even the world. What's your thought on the idea of, Rochester having a possibility of becoming, a little version of Silicon Valley or Boston or New York City?
It's a lot closer today than it was 10 years ago to that moment. And truly, not because, I live here. But, when we started Virtual Scopics 10 years ago, that was true. There was very few local investors and even fewer of those who were comfortable with any kind of technology, like PC, for example, or, software. They didn't understand. They came from, I don't know what kind of type of money, but it had nothing to do with technology. And so that's what they understood. They would understand if you were doing a food company or if you were doing a gas station or something else, but not technology. And that was a very difficult process for us to go through. Nowadays, actually, there are people that do understand technology. They try to nurture technology companies. There are individual investors. There's, for example, there's Rochester Angel Network. I mean, some people can say, well, they're still kind of old money, but we've been to some of their meetings, and you know what? There are some younger people there, and they do look into more technology, web, these sorts of things. So it's another avenue to pursue. And I think there's something in Buffalo as well. I mean, you and Mike made some.
Well, actually, there's a lot of very interesting stuff that's happening. Unfortunately, the two examples I'm going to give are not in Rochester, but there's Z80, where you guys just got accepted, GradFly, which is an incubator there. And Syracuse has now started an incubator as well that's based on Techstars, the Techstars model that's around the country. They just had their first demo day a few weeks ago. Very exciting stuff. But I'm actually personally bullish not just on the area, but on Rochester in particular, and for two reasons. I mean, one is this is a really great place to actually start a company, and in many ways that's the most important part, because in places like San Francisco right now, it's very, very expensive to hire people. It's very, very expensive to actually have space. One of their biggest problems, and why you actually see more acquisitions now than you have before, is that software engineers have become so hard to find that a lot of these things that are called acquisitions are really just acquisitions of engineering talent. And oftentimes when things get stuck at those companies is because somebody's left to some slightly better offer. Here, people, the cost of living is much, much better, but you have great individuals here. The two main universities we have here are both amazing. One of the things that both the previous company, Linnell Systems, as well as iCardiac has done, we have had dozens and dozens of RIT co-ops, many of which have gone on. Actually, in the previous company, Linnell Systems, our CTO was a person started as an RIT co-op. Obviously, took a few years to get to CTO, but the head of marketing, etc. This is a great place for talent. It's affordable because the area is affordable. And there's all sorts of good things to point to. I mean, we do have one of the highest per capita rates of patents anywhere in the country. That's a really big deal, and it explains to people when we did go outside of Rochester why it is that we were here and why it made sense to start a business here. And if you can start a business here and do it cost effectively, oftentimes like you said, you can find people to actually invest in. In fact, I'd rather have that than the reverse problem, where it'll be easier to raise money, but then it's really, really expensive to start a company and very difficult to hold on to talent. So I love Rochester from this perspective. Although that being said, we actually also have a European office in Poland, because many companies need to be global. And we have the Rochester of Poland, Lodz. We're affiliated there with the university that was the first university in all of Europe to do a heart transplant. So that's not why we picked it, but it makes it for a good story.
There's a lot of jokes out there, but
No. Poland is an amazing place. I mean, it's one of the few countries that did not go down when the rest of the recessionary pressures kind of caused most of Europe to contract. I mean, Poland is an extremely great place for many perspectives. Great English skills, great educations. Do you know that in your country, up until about 20 years ago, only 8% of people had master's degrees, and now, if you look at people under 30, it's almost 70% master's degrees are higher.
Wow.
I mean, it's actually an amazing success.
Where's you guys from, by the way?
Russia. I was born in St. Petersburg.
Good people. Good luck.
When you were raising money for iCardiac or Virtual Scouting, was it a team effort, or was it usually one person who was always in charge of getting out there? And
well, as I mentioned, they want to see a team, so it didn't have to be a team effort at every single meeting. But once in a while, when they start broadening out your kind of the meetings, and they say, "Oh, I want to bring in partner X, Y, and Z," usually then that's when we have to come in, because they want to see that it's not just one person in a dream, because that's dangerous on many levels. That one person could be the wrong person, they could have a health issue, they could move away, whatever. So you want to be a team in those circumstances.
I want to move back to pitching, and you kind of touched on something, but I'm wondering if you could expand on it a little bit. Profiling the VCs you're pitching to. Some people will fund particular segments and won't fund others. Some people at the West Coast, there's a couple of VCs that if you don't have a Stanford pedigree, don't bother. How do you go about that? What's important? How do we work it?
Sure. That's actually a very important question. You're right. Actually, one of the first things you should do before trying to, tell your lawyer or whatever to put you in touch with somebody at a VC firm is to make sure that they've done some sort of deal. And this is not difficult information to find. You go on their website. There's always a section that says portfolio companies or portfolio, and look for something that looks kind of similar to what you've done. And if you could dig in a little bit deeper, also try to get a sense as to when did they actually put money in it. Not the timing, but at what stage was that company when they put the money in. Because you're right, there's only so much time in the day, and you don't want to be like flying off to San Francisco to visit somebody that ultimately has never invested in a company like yours, and therefore doesn't have the comfort level with it. And or if they do, they're going to say, okay, come back in 3 years when you're similar to that other company when you have 8 million revenue or whatever. So that's a great
You
point.
also want to make sure that they actually still have money. Nowadays, a lot of the funds, they're making funds. So, and that takes a little bit of digging to find that out. It's not entirely obvious because they of course, they need to represent like we're a big fund, did all these deals, and some really big names actually. We found out that they have no money. And so you know what? But they will meet with you, and they will, invite you to come in and have meetings and stuff. So you're going to be wasting your time and money with those. So then just check that whichever way you can. We did a lot of press release searching and things of that nature, asking around and trying to make sure that they are still investing, that they're not just running around raising another fund at the moment.
Well, and actually the way to think about that is to also go back into their press releases and say, okay, and oftentimes they'll say which funds they have, and then go a little bit further and look into the press release to see, okay, when did they raise that particular fund? And usually in that press release, they will also have information about what is it that they're focusing on, because they have some sort of investment thesis that they sold to their limited partners in that case. And maybe it changed from what the things that they used to do. And so, for instance, some very practical advice. So we have a number of different venture capital firms in Rochester. Trillium is one of them. Well, Trillium had a fund that was specifically focused on university, early stage, etc. One of the things you have to know is that typically these funds are for 10 years, and during the first 3 to 5 years, that's when they're meeting people and they're serious about actually putting money in, because they need a certain window. Because after year 10 comes, they need to go to the limited partners, and either they hopefully have given large amounts back, or they need to come up with some sort of contingency plan, like, oh, we invested all this money, but these companies still are not ready to be sold, etc., and now what? And so they don't want to be in that position. So for instance, we were the last investment of the $1 trillion fund that was focused on early stage, and that was in the 5th year, because the back 5 years of that 10-year period, while they'll meet with people, maybe they'll invest in some other fund if they have one, or just sort of wait to see what happens if they raise another one. During those last 5 years, they're actually more focused on sitting on your board and getting you toward an exit where they can get their money back. So Trillium, right now, their funds that are active are more focused on later stage stuff. So for instance, this company Auction Direct that you always hear, that's one of their big companies, but that's not a technology company in the pure sense of things, and it was a much more late stage company. Excel Partners, this is the one where you can still go, and they do go. They just got money from something called Innovate New York. It's closing sometime in the next month or two. And so they're going to have money.
To go.
Right. And they're a nonprofit. They're kind of owned by the University of Rochester. They don't have the same profit motives. They're willing to take risks and invest the money at an earlier stage and more scientific.
And these guys invest in way out there. So, it's very, very early stage, and they will consider it because partially they're government funding, and so that's their thing. And they get money, so place to go.
I mean, the third place that people mentioned, I think was mentioned earlier today, was Rochester Angel Network. They sort of don't have a totally concrete thesis about what they'll invest in, but one of the pieces of advice for that is that typically these are individuals who are not necessarily that scientifically technical themselves. They're kind of more okay, I've made my money, maybe I'm retired, this is a way for me to give back to the community. And so they're not going to do due diligence and necessarily understand what they're investing in, but they want to, and therefore they will invest money typically when somebody else who has done the due diligence, like a Trillium or an Excel or someone like that, has come into the deal. So typically don't go to them with something very complex that you don't already have money coming into from some other source that they'll think is credible institutional investment.
A lot of them are expert on certain generics.
For Rosh Hashanah. Yes, no, of course. And there are individuals, by the way, who step outside of the group role. In fact, that is one of the nice things about interacting with them.
There
Because
are like the people who sell Propel, who sell the Rochester Propel,
Yeah.
those have $100 million.
That's a good point. And actually, what does oftentimes happen is that while the group itself does not invest, oftentimes people who present there, if they have something that kind of connects with an individual, they end up putting money in outside of it. Trillium actually does the same thing. They have the Trillium Angel network as well. So people who are particularly excited about some opportunity will put money on top of the Trillium money. So you're right. I don't mean to disparage the people there. I'm saying as a group, oftentimes they will not come in and yeah.
In the context of starting a business, regarding point number 2, which is finding the right people on the team, what are some of the more subtle clues that maybe some indicators that some people didn't belong, because that's a pretty vulnerable position to be in, and it doesn't be fatal.
Subtle clues.
Not so subtle.
Not subtle.
Yeah, some of them are not so subtle. I'm trying to think, a good example. Well, we do want to look for attitudes. So, for example, if you're interviewing somebody and they're, very experienced and they come across, very well, and the things that they've done and how they represent themselves and so forth, and the first thing they're interested in, how much you're going to pay me, or this not that it's a bad thing that people want to make money. Everybody wants to make money. It's understandable. So we assume it's always there. But if that, and then they're asking you, oh, but can I have this, or can I have this benefit? Oh, but my other company. So if the bulk of the negotiation centers on them trying to negotiate every little thing from the benefit package and from the salary, to me personally, it's a red flag, because I'm looking for somebody who thinks like an owner. I'm inviting them to participate in the business that we're building together. So I'm looking for people who are here, let me roll up my sleeves and do things. And they get very richly rewarded. By the way, the team boys that report to me in sales, they make way more money than I do. And there are some examples in other parts of the company where that's the case. They make more than their bosses and the founders of the company. So the reward is always there. It's just, for us, it's important to make sure that we reward the right people. Okay? And they need to show first that they actually deserve that.
Yeah, flexibility is important. The other thing to keep in mind is, especially if you're going to take people who are in situations where there were departments, and so, or people under them, or support staff, none of that stuff exists, obviously, in a startup. And so people need to, and you can actually talk about this, with them oftentimes, and they'll look a little bit uncomfortable that, okay, you're going to be doing this, that, and that for yourself. And when something comes up, there isn't a department, there's you and only you, and what you're really looking for in those cases are people who don't mind truly rolling up their sleeves and doing anything and everything, even if it's not part of their job description. I would say the other part that's, and this is in many ways, or for us was a little bit more difficult, is sometimes it's not even necessarily their fault, the people that they're no longer kind of make sense for the picture. Some of this happens when you're shifting to plan B, C, or D. Because some of the people that you brought in that were maybe very, very well suited for plan A, all of a sudden they're kind of, you're not sure what to do with them. And you could see it oftentimes happening where they sort of raise their hand for random assignments, which is a very nice thing. But then, there's this feeling like, okay, now the person's doing things that totally don't make sense anymore. They're probably not feeling comfortable. Everyone else doesn't understand. In many ways, some of those kind of hiring mistakes were the most difficult, because it's not that they even did anything wrong. They just weren't the right person anymore based on something new that you were doing.
Yeah. Also, be aware of kind of industry experts if you're hiring, especially in the I'm running the sales department, so in obviously our industry, big industry, contract research organizations, there are salespeople from contract research organizations. There's always temptation to find industry better and put them in charge of sales, to go and selling this thing. Unfortunately, industry veterans grew up in the industry where this thing that you're just going to sell didn't exist. They are themselves not comfortable with it. They don't know why the customer would buy it, because the customers used to buy something completely different from them. And so oftentimes, and this was true I iCardiac, it was true in virtual scopics. We did have a few industry veterans who had to let them go because they're just not comfortable and they can't understand and they can't get why a customer would be excited about this technology and it just never works out. Not because they're not smart or it's just a product of experience. I would say. So sometimes experience hurts. But some people are they come in and because they saw the problem before. We have another lady that I hired who's truly industry veteran. She's been in the industry for 26 years. And she got it even before, we started working with her when she was in a different company. She was a partner of ours. And she was such a pioneer, such a champion of our company, our little startup with her bigger company, because she's like, I saw this problem, I know this problem, I had customers with this problem, and this is a solution. And so she became the best salesperson for this technology.
Well, and actually, and maybe this also goes to your question, what is it that oftentimes is kind of a clue that maybe the person isn't right? Although I would say this is more of a clue when you're potentially just hiring for the first time. Attitude and enthusiasm, and not just enthusiasm in the generic sense, but very specific enthusiasm is so key. People can have all the great credentials, but I personally do not ever approve the hiring of individuals who don't really explain pretty well why it is that they're sitting there. Why iCardiac? Why now? What is it you're enthusiastic about? They better have read the website. They better have done everything that shows wow, this is my dream. This is my opportunity. It's kind of hard to frankly fake that, especially when you dig into great. What do you know about a company? What would you improve if you were here? With all sorts of, it's pretty easy to actually figure out if they really prepared and thought it through. And if they haven't, it's just usually not a good fit, especially kind of in the early days of a startup when there are almost every week some sort of set of events that says, oh man, this isn't good. Because that's what most of the startup is, especially behind closed doors. If you're senior enough, it's like, oh man, you can't have people whose enthusiasm is so light or so superficial that they're going to get disgruntled by that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on that, there's a really good book. It's called the No Asshole Rule. So it's kind of talking about how do you build kind of a civilized workplace. So it's got a great title, but it's a really good book too. It's kind of interesting to check out. I was wondering about the idea of I've seen kind of conflicting stuff on whether or not you have a defined amount for your ask, and I just wondered what maybe if you guys could talk a little bit about whether or not you did that or didn't do that, and what was your thought process about how you decided? Because that issue of are you asking for too much, too little?
Right. That's actually a very good question. Usually the best way to handle it is through some sort of range, because the last thing you want to have happen is if you ask for $2.5 million and you could only get 2.2 million in, suddenly it feels like a failure. So you want to have the bottom number still be something that's credible, still be something that makes sense in this, based on your evaluation. And hopefully it's a number that you can not just hit, but like most other things in life, you want to exceed that a little bit to get people, because that's what will get people to actually close usually. So, that's, I don't know if you have any other advice, but I think a range is typically
range is typically good, and also remember that that's going to be, let's say, a rule of thumb, 30% that you're going to sell to the VCs. So if you want $1 million, your valuation is $3 million, then implied. And so look then at the total number and see, is it plausible? Are there comparative deals that were done in this space for the company at this stage of this type of technology? So kind of, you can pinpoint the number that way as well.
But it can't be too wide of a range also. Like you can't be like, I want 1 to 9 million. It's more like, okay, I want 2 to 3, or I want 1.5 to 3. Something that still makes sense no matter where within that number you end up actually falling. That one, you could build a business on it, and that these numbers in terms of the percentage of group sold kind of make sense for the VCs as well.
Question for those that excel or trading venture capital funding, do they require all the prototyping build demonstration? Is that a requirement?
I don't think it's a requirement. It certainly helps.
It certainly helps. The further you are in the product development, the better opportunities you have. And so few companies today, Excel might. Trillium probably would like to see it like that, because the funding that Trillium is left is from the later stage. funds. Excel probably won't ask you for program, but if you have one, it's a big plus.
Another thing, should we volunteer is saying that in the final deal, they will get the five times of 10% of the initial investment. Should we volunteer that kind of
Oh, you mean they get 5 times the return on their investment? No.
I mean, should you offer it, maybe what, like that's your part of your business plan?
So I was told by an accountant, you have to put it up front saying that they will be guaranteed 10 times of.
You mean like a?
No, I mean, we kind of impute that based on something else. So typically, I mean, it's a little bit of a game, quite honestly, but most VC pitches have this like line, and it looks like the hockey stick line where you're not making much in the first 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden it shoots up, and it always miraculously, within 5 to 6 years, gets to 100 million. No matter what company it is, it always gets to 100 million. And so from that, from kind of those cash flows or from those profits, they calculate kind of what they think their
Yeah, but I think
return
the
will be.
question was more about the liquidation preferences.
Oh, we talked about liquidation preferences? Oh boy, you really want to, okay, so there's a few things when you negotiate with the VCs that kind of sneak up and really end up hurting. They don't look that bad at the beginning. And all of the liquidation preferences and the dividend percentages, I mean, those two things are particularly difficult because oftentimes people have, they have very optimistic ideas, oh, within 4 years it's this, and if we calculate it, it usually becomes something quite worse than that. And you also set a precedent because most of the time, when you, especially if it's an early round, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have rounds on top of it, and that those people will invest again. And now you sort of set a precedent, and now you're going to, usually give money on top of that. And I mean, I think if we had gone with the dividend preferences and liquidation, the dividends and liquidation preferences that initially were offered to us, I mean, I think that within a couple of years, this would no longer be worth our while to be in that company. I mean, it's like anything else. It's like compound interest, right? I mean, it sneaks up on you and becomes a very, very big deal. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why, even with moderately successful startup companies, oftentimes the founders don't actually end up doing particularly well because of liquidation preferences and dividends.
That's the point you have to negotiate in your part as much as you can, because those things really do matter. But Excel has, I think they have very light terms, and they have their term sheet on the website, or at least used to have their term sheet. So if you go there, you probably will find what they
I think oftentimes they actually pin their evaluation on the next round or something.
Yeah.
So Excel is much better and more
easier.
flexible than most of us.
You had a question?
Yeah, back to employees just for a second, who you obviously you want them to be very invested in the venture. Do most or some of them get equity in the company, or only the key people? Or?
Well, I mean, we actually, every single employee of iCardiac has stock options for a number of reasons. One, I think we talked about being very lean. One of the nice things is that you're able to use it a little bit to supplant some of the market rates that you otherwise would have to pay for salaries. So frankly, it helps when you're trying to be as lean as possible to give out part of the money in equity. But on top of that, it really does build a very unique culture. Now, unfortunately, in some places, and Rochester is among them, many people have never been in an environment where they got stock options in a private company, so they don't necessarily value it as much as others. And so we always take that into consideration. Some people are much more about the cash and other things, and in that case, we weight the offer toward those things. But for those people who kind of believe and dream and are willing to take less money and really value the stock options, they get options. The other thing that we do, which is a little bit different than what most people do around here, but even what they do in other companies, is we don't actually provide the largest or most of those options up front. Because for various reasons, you don't always know who's going to really be valuable. In fact, there are quite a few people that sort of came in and they weren't coming in a very serious position. They got small amounts of options, but boy, did they grow into a huge role, and they got large amounts of options. And it was much more comfortable to do. But the second part of it is that you want to be able to give people something every single year, because it does take time. And every year it basically acts as a supplement to the amount of cash that people would otherwise expect for a good job. And I think that there's just something different when we own something, and I think our culture reflects that at iCardiac.
So you talked about, briefly you mentioned VCs gaining the ability to affect the management team. Is that purely a function of the percentage of the company that you give up, or is that a negotiable point?
It's a very good question, and one of the top lessons learned that we should have included. Yes and yes, and here's how to deal with this. Well, first of all, there are a couple of things. One is VCs, the more important one is the composition of the board of directors that you're going to fund with. Because after the funding happens, because you have external funding, you were supposed to have a corporate governance board of directors. And now you as a founder are reporting to the board of directors. So some naive first-time entrepreneurs think that, well, it should be completely, totally independent, which means we're going to go find some people from the internet and the local community that we don't know, but they have some big business titles, and they're going to be our independent board members, and the VCs are going to take board seats, and VCs are going to appoint the chairman of the board, and that's how it's going to work. Do not do that. So, because you're immediately giving out control of your destiny, and who can fire you or can fire you as a founder, actually. So the best thing to do is to negotiate as well. This is another point, you need to negotiate with the VCs. We've negotiated that Mike, actually one of the co-founders, is the chairman of the board. Alex is a board member. And I'm a secretary, which means I'm not a board member, but I'm at every board meeting, and I of course can speak out. And so this way we have all the founders in the board meetings. We have independent board members which are independent, but they're known to us. We have experience with them from past work in large corporations, and they're very valuable, and they bring a lot of expertise to the board. But we also know these people, and they're known entities to us, so we know how they think, and we're aligned as far as our thinking and our approach. And so we've tried to negotiate also one of the three VCs that invested in us actually has only observer seat, and Pfizer had observer seat. So as much as possible, try to negotiate it and try to structure it around such that you don't immediately give up control.
I mean, part of the reason we had some of that leverage to be able to not give up kind of board control is because we did have these individuals who were putting money in separately, and we had obviously also therefore leverage to be able to negotiate a little bit better. But oftentimes what unfortunately does happen is when your sole investors are VCs, yeah, they absolutely expect that, hey, we're the only money in, we're going to take some sort of lead, and either they have veto rights. I mean, there's so many different ways to structure it. But that's another reason why it's so important to find a way to have leverage in those negotiations. And in our case, that leverage was the fact that we had other investors who were more aligned with us, and therefore the VCs never had majority control of the company anyway, and let alone the ability to impose contractual sovereignty over us.
What's your feel, your opinion on when it's appropriate to go to an angel versus a VC? Is it based on like how big you think you're going to grow, what your expected exit's going to be, like you're going to go public or you're going to get bought out, or really, what's the dividing line of when you think one's the better choice than the other?
Sure. Well, I mean, with VCs, there's a very kind of clear trajectory that they're going to expect you to be on. I mean, first of all, you have to have a company that has, like where the $100 million hockey stick has some potential realistic chance of happening, but they also have a timing issue. Because even if they invested relatively early on from their 10-year fund and they're in year 2 or 3 or whatever, still within 7 to 8 years, they're expecting to be able to get money back. They're also kind of different. Than angels, because angels oftentimes have something else going on. They're not as diversified, and they're not thinking of it the same way a VC does. A VC really does, I mentioned the poker analogy before, think of these things more almost like a poker player, where they have a certain number of hands that they're playing. They're going to want to kind of see as much as they can see for as small amounts as possible, and then double and triple and go all in on a few hands, right? I mean, that's kind of the strategy behind it. And they're not even interested in kind of oftentimes that, well, that could be something, I don't know. I mean, oftentimes when they think your company is not the one, for them, they're actually okay with the binary outcome. In other words, they don't want you to be like a 1X where you return their money. I mean, they're fine with it, but they're going to push you to either be a big success, or if you're a zero, that's fine. In fact, they want to even like push it quicker. That's why oftentimes also they change up the management team. So a lot of the times, whether to go to an angel or to go to a VC really depends on whether your company is, first of all, the kind of company that can legitimately do that. Right. And secondly, if you're comfortable with that trajectory for your company and having a much more binary outlook, you know, I'm either going big or totally going home and probably, you know, fired in the process, and it'll be embarrassing. I mean, it's just, it's a real question, or it should be, in the mind of every startup person, whether you go in front of a VC. It's the biggest single decision you're actually making when you think about funding.
Yeah, and actually, even iCardiac is not the type of the company that a traditional big name VC would consider a success. Even though we're profitable, very large, and growing very well in our industry, the industry itself is small. You know, the expectations were, you know, several billion-dollar market, but it didn't come through. So our market is limited. We've created a really successful company in it, but it's not a $100 million company. Okay, so by measures of big VCs, that's not what they want to see. They want to see 0 or 100 million. Okay, so they don't want to see this. And in fact, recently a competitor of ours, very similarly sized and a similar stage where we are, also doing pretty well, just got forced into a miserable sale by the VC whose fund ran out the 10-year clip. And guess what? They gave up control and they got forced into this liquidation scenario. Which is great for us because the coast is clear. But this is what you don't, you know, this is what you get from a big name VC. So you got, you know, you play with big boys, you have to be a big boy. Now, what our strategy might probably work out better with the financial buyer down the line when our, you know, we have very good profitable business. So as our earnings grow, we become more interesting for private equity firms to come in and buy out for the earnings. But that's a different scenario that requires longer time. And we have, you know, since we have control, we're not selling, so we're waiting for that to happen in a few years. And that's what creates luxury. If you think that your business is kind of like in between or maybe small, it's probably a good idea to start with an angel and then go to a VC.
I mean, that last point is actually quite interesting to think about too, because things have really changed in terms of who are the potential buyers of all sorts of companies, because there is a very thriving M&A market, but that M&A market is really for these companies that are profitable and some with some sort of defendable position, but oftentimes these are more like $10 to $70 million acquisitions, and the acquirers are totally different than the acquirers of years past. They're not necessarily the big companies. A lot of times they're foreign companies who want to get a foothold, for instance, in the United States. They're actually now a lot of these like family offices who no longer believe that or no longer feel totally comfortable putting large amounts of money in VC funds, in stocks and bonds, etc. And they're actually looking for alternative investments, and for them, profitable companies are the thing. So a lot of the things that have actually driven the M&A market, and the parts of it that have been driven, are these smaller companies. And there's absolutely nothing wrong in life. In fact, it makes life a lot easier, oftentimes, to aim to be one of those companies and have that kind of success story. Frankly, it's also nicer along the road, too. There's, by the way, a good presentation on that happened at the national meeting this year, the National Venture Capital Association. I think their website is ndca.org. That specifically talked about I think it's called Exits in 2012, and you'll actually see like what those numbers are, and they're staggering. I mean, the people who buy companies now are a totally different group of people that used to buy companies 5 or 10 years ago, and therefore, obviously, what you should be aiming to build is quite different as well.
Great. Well, if nobody else has any questions,